Okay, I believe we're live again. This is Speed, the bottom of the helix. Show of hands who have not heard about model rail radio. About 15 or so. Welcome to Mr. Tom Barbalet.
Thank you very much. Great introduction. Let me get my slides up and we'll get talking about how easy it is to do this thing called podcasting. So, a little introduction. My name is Tom Barbalet. I have created, maintained, I don't know. I'm like a zookeeper for this thing called Model Rail Radio. modelrailradio.com and barbalet@gmail.com, or you can get me at tom@modelrailradio.com as well. So if you want to make contact, please do. So I wanted to give thanks first to a few regular listeners. I do this talk periodically. I make some modifications, but over the past few weeks, we have been doing weekly recordings of Model Rail Radio due to COVID-19. And I want to send out a shout out to Mike Slater, Clark Cooning, who should be familiar to some of you, a fellow by the name of Mike O'Dorney, who's a local to me, and also two gentlemen by the name of Martin Coombs and Simon Hill. I had the pleasure of talking with Martin and Simon this morning on Model Rail Radio, so I recorded a recording this morning. And also spoke to a gentleman called Hunter Hewson, and I'll talk a little bit about Hunter in a minute. So some background to who I am. As you might hear from the accent, I was born in Adelaide in South Australia, and I wasn't actually based in Adelaide. My family moved to Canberra when I was a young boy, so I'd go back to Adelaide periodically, usually a few weeks of the year, usually around the Christmas period. And I found it fascinating because I'd spend time with my grandparents. I'd stay with my grandparents primarily. My grandfather had a train set, and he just, as an adult, my grandfather at that time, it was amazing to see an adult being so passionate about something. And the train set wasn't a permanent thing. It wasn't allowed, but it did come out on a regular basis. And it was just something to see my grandfather basically playing with a train set and getting just as much fun out of it as I was getting out of it as well. And my other grandfather, my paternal grandfather, was a barber, and he continued to cut hair well into his 80s. His brother, my great uncle, is still alive. He lives in New Zealand, and in his 90s, he continues to cut hair. So the whole nature of the banter that you get in a barber's shop, the nature of a community, very similar to actually the kind of discussion that you have in a train store. But also through my early childhood, I loved recording interviews. I have some tapes actually of when I was 3 and 4, actually. I'd wander around with a tape recorder just interviewing people. So this is some background to who I was before I got into podcasting. My primary passion, I'm not traditionally a model railroader. I don't have a layout. I do have some trains. I'm a member of the local train club. So I'm in this kind of cusp associated with model railroading. But my primary passion is associated with computer simulation. And this is associated with creating really rich computer simulation environments where you have plants and animals and, birds and fish and, lots of different layers of simulation. And in part, it's got links to model railroading because it's about creating a perfect world, kind of utopian existence. But it also, very similar to model railroading, requires countless hours of tinkering. Now, I have been doing this kind of semi-professionally for more than 24 years now. So a substantial portion of my life has been spent around computer simulation. But it's not a huge community, and it's not something that is relatively well understood. Although my work has been used by Apple and Intel, it's still a very small community, but very similar to model railroading in the sense that once people discover this community, even if they're not part of it, they have a general interest in the community. So it's probably important that I talk about what a podcast is. A podcast, as I use a traditional definition because I started more than a decade ago, but it's episodic audio or video content that you can download anytime. So rather than being forced, although I record live and I have live callers and, we have a live chat and, there is a live component to some of what I do, it is consumable at any time. You can listen to a podcast whenever. I have more than 10 years worth of podcast audio that's available online that you can download. You can listen to me in my early monologues. You can listen to the first few shows of Model Rail Radio as you listen to the later shows of Model Rail Radio. There's no distinction about when you can start listening. You can download it at any time. You can listen anywhere. All it requires is that you have some kind of device that you can listen to the audio on. And now car stereos have this, obviously phones, computers. There's a wide variety of different devices that are available that enable you to listen to podcasts. So certainly pretty well everything that's computerized now will allow you to listen to podcasts, and a wide variety of, like I say, traditional things like car stereos. Even, there are some physical radios that enable you to listen to podcasts. There is a changing definition of what a podcast is. And what's interesting here is probably 10, 15 years ago was a very distinct definition associated with audio or video podcasts. Now people talk about YouTube associated with podcasts. So there are a number of kind of contemporary model railroad podcasters that don't do anything that I do with regards to feeds and this kind of stuff. They just put this stuff on YouTube and they call it a podcast. And I think increasingly the definition is shifting, basically, about what a podcast is. So I wanted to give a more traditional definition, but then say there's a certain degree of flexibility in there as well. And certainly folks that are producing stuff on YouTube now and doing that kind of stuff, they're also producing podcasts. So I started podcasting officially back in 2006. And podcasting, depending on who you talk to, started around 2004, 2005. I love the format. I mean, I really like the idea of radio anyway, and this notion of kind of egalitarian radio where anyone can participate. I really like that idea. But it took me about a year to start podcasting, mainly because I wanted to get the right equipment. And that, I think, was not necessary. I probably could have started with the equipment that I had at any given time. But, I just wanted to do something that was slightly, of a reasonable quality. And what I started doing was a series of different formats of podcasts. I started primarily interviewing people that were part of these simulations, these computer simulations. And I also tried a couple of monologue podcasts and just tried various techniques associated with what would create a community of listeners, because that's ultimately what you're trying to create with podcasts, is creating a community of listeners. So through doing the podcast recordings about the computer simulations that interested me, I created a small community. 200 odd people, basically, that were listening to these podcasts. And within that, I very much recorded for the community. So I got community feedback. If people said you should go and talk to so-and-so, I went and interviewed so-and-so. But I started building a community around the podcast as a form. I then moved to a live format, and the first podcast that I did this in was a podcast called Biota Live, which you can still, it's biotacast.org. You can still get all the original live shows, so it's still available. And this was the idea that people that made these computer simulations like to talk about what they were working on, right? Similar to model railroading. They liked calling in and talking about the simulations that they were working on. And I had very early on an open environment. Anyone could call in. In fact, I met a number of people who just randomly found out about this podcast and called in through that weren't actually simulators. Some of them had some crossover interests and these kind of things. But I created a podcast called Stone 8 with a fellow called Heron Stone. He wasn't a simulator. He was a linguist. And he just called into one of these podcasts. And from that, I created another podcast. I spun off a podcast from that. So what was really important to me was just creating a format of respect. So we were all people that had worked on simulations. We all had some background in this. And it was just to create a level playing field, basically. So we could have, relatively famous academics, published authors, a variety of different folk that would all call in. And we get, kid hobbyists that would call in as well. And it was passionate. People got heated about various topics. The kind of generational aspect to the simulations came through. There were folks that wrote these simulations in the 70s and 80s that couldn't understand what folks were doing in the 2000s. There was all kinds of, interesting things. And unfortunately, there was elements of politics. As I said, there's this notion of kind of traditional simulation versus newer simulation. And obviously, at the time, there was a very big kind of creationist, religious, anti-simulation backlash kind of thing as well. So it was an interesting scene. At about 2009, a number of the participants who I recorded this podcast with went and did other things. So a few were picked up by local companies. One guy went to work for Google. A couple of them were involved with startups. One went and worked on more biology as opposed to simulated biology. So basically, there were 5 key participants. Of the 5 key participants, it went down to just me and then whoever else was calling in. So basically, by 2009, I was looking for another podcast. And what interested me was communities and creating communities, because what I'd done with this podcast was basically with Barbalet Live was create a community and create a community. And look, people still listen to it. I mean, I record it very frequently now, but it has a large, listener base of undergraduate students and basically folks in early entry academia that has an interest in these topics. So, but I wanted to see, could I create a community around a podcast? And I did a surveying of a number of podcasts. Wargaming, historical wargaming, miniature wargaming, these kind of things. I had interest there. That was a community that actually had a number of podcasts and wide variety of different factors were served by that community. I think for the size of model railroading, there should be about 18 to 24 podcasts. If you look at, even my wife's a quilter, if you look at quilting, there are this number of podcasts. In model railroading, we are still dramatically underserved by the number of podcasts. And when I started recording Model Rail Radio, there were only 2 other podcasts that were on offer at the time. There was the Scotty Mason Show, which has become Micro's Live. Scotty Mason Show went through a few iterations. And then there was the late Ryan Anderson's Model Railcast Show. And the Model Railcast Show is still going on. Tim Harrison and co, occasionally Craig Biscaya and others, still record that. They've gone back to a slightly more regular format. I think COVID-19 might have helped them get more folks on. But it was interesting looking at those 2 podcasts. Ryan Anderson's podcast in particular used a company called Libsyn. I know Lionel Strang has been a part of these recordings previously. Lionel uses Libsyn as well. I knew a few of the people at Libsyn, the technology officers and what have you. Libsyn's model is around getting monthly subscriptions for podcasts. I'm making money up front with podcasts. And Ryan was a heavy proponent of that. It really was almost a kind of religious methodology that came through podcasting in the mid-2000s, this notion that you'd get sponsors and you'd become, a commercial entity. And I took a slightly different viewpoint than that. But, certainly I've had a lot of correspondence with Scotty Mason, a lot of correspondence before he passed away with the late Ryan Anderson. And I came to this thing on the backs of giants associated with what they had done previously. So one of the questions about recording a podcast about model railroading is, when I started recording Model Rail Radio, what did I really know about model railroading? So my grandfather was a model railroader. He wasn't a passionate one. He didn't belong to clubs, but, he certainly within the 2-rail Hornby O scale, he knew enough about, he knew a bit about that aspect of the hobby. I also had a great uncle who is still alive and who I've seen recently, who had a live steam engine, a small one, a model steam engine, but still one that ran. As a boy, I went to an annual train show in Canberra, Australia, where I kind of grew up. And that was a huge train show. It was really impressive. My parents, from an early age, would just leave me there for a majority of the day. And then I kind of wander away just completely awestruck by. And that wasn't just trains, although trains were a large portion of that. There was model radio control boats and a bunch of other things that were there as well. As a boy, I got the Overlander Lima set, which I still have components of, which was a kind of plastic train, entry-level train that I think a number of kids in Australia were probably given. And like I said, I'd listened very closely. In fact, I'd sent email correspondence and had quite a bit of interaction with both of the 2 podcasts in the space before I launched Model Rail Radio. I did, however, have an experience when I was about 16 working with physicists. And I took a lot of that knowledge into Model Rail Radio. The idea was prior to leaving high school, I worked with these physicists. I filled out a form. Basically, the local schools had a relationship with one of the local universities. You filled out a bunch of forms associated with what interested you, and then they put you with scientists. And at the time, I really didn't want to do anything associated with computers. I'd already written a bunch of computer simulations and the antivirus software, did a bunch of stuff with software. So I put down that, physics was what I wanted to do. And I did that primarily because physics at the time was my lowest scoring mark, so I thought, well, if I'm around physicists, I'm going to improve with that. And it was just amazing. I worked with a number of physicists in their 70s and 80s. One physicist who was, really at the later stages of his career and his life. And I computerized all their simulation equipment, even their physical bath equipment, all the stuff that they use to collect results. They used to do it all manually, literally paper printouts, manually turning dials. And I computerized all that, which was just amazing. I mean, it gave me a job for, 6 odd years, 5 and a bit years, basically, working with these amazing, elderly gentlemen physicists. They could drink a lot more tea, basically. I was computerizing things. They didn't need to touch the experiments anymore. They just ran for themselves. The tea consumption went through the roof. The results actually improved dramatically as well. I mean, they published a lot of stuff based on my interaction, which was an immediate feedback loop of actually being there. But the thing that I took away from that was when I was 16, I didn't speak the language of physics. But within about 3 months of just immersively being in this environment with these physicists, I started to be able to speak the language of physics. And I realized it's very similar to learning any language. You basically, if you can immerse yourself in the environment, you'll learn the language. And I felt the same was probably true with model railroading. So I launched Model Rail Radio September 2009, and I did it just with a monologue. The first 2 shows, I think, are just monologues of me talking about my experience with model railroading and with trains. And if you want to go back and listen, and many listeners have, it's an interesting example of just laying out the blueprint of what I wanted to do with this recording. And interestingly enough, within 2 recordings, I actually had my first caller, a gentleman by the name of Chris Abbott. And honestly, if it weren't for Chris Abbott, Model Rail Radio probably wouldn't be here today. Chris and I talked extensively for the early recordings. We got on a gentleman by the name of Clark Kooning, who I thanked in the start of this talk. But the ability to move from a monologue to a dialogue was just absolutely amazing. And I've used a number of internet call-in formats. We're going to talk a little bit about the technology in a few minutes. But I started using, I think, Blog Talk Radio or TalkShoe. I went through some iteration early on, and then I moved on to Skype. And I had a bunch of knowledge that I'd already cultivated with Biota Live. I already knew how to do this thing with doing Biota Live. So I was already in a situation where, I knew, what it is to have a call-in show, what it is to have intro music, and how to, maintain callers and maintain an active chat and these kind of things. So Model Rail Radio was very much built on what I'd done with Biota Live. Now, in contrast to a lot of people that talk about podcasting, my view with podcasts is you've got to keep the cost relatively low. And I did this for a variety of reasons. Within the early period, I'm trying to think certainly within the Model Rail Radio period, initially, the company I was working for had closed. We had a bunch of permutations, both my wife and I, skillfully at the same time, having companies that, just disappeared. That was the nature, I guess, of the economic collapse as it kind of wandered into 2009, 2010. So I've always wanted to keep the cost of podcasting at a reasonable level. I would have said historically a bare minimum, but recently I've spent more on microphones, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a few slides. But the web hosting that I use is almost completely free. It's basically distributed over all my websites. So the actual cost of the Model Rail Radio website, probably less than $20 a year. The audio hosting, I use the Internet Archive. I couldn't have done Model Rail Radio spending, commercial. Well, I don't know. I mean, I don't know what it would have been if I'd gone through Libsyn or other audio hosting providers, but I use the Internet Archive. I think the Internet Archive is very receptive to this kind of free content. I used to donate money to the Internet Archive. Not this year, but historically I've donated every few years to the Internet Archive. And all the tools that are necessary to produce podcasts are basically freely maintained by a community. And there's plenty of help. I mean, I offer this assistance to anyone who wants to get started as well. So if you're watching this and thinking, how do I get started? I don't understand the technology, whatever. My surname, barbalet@gmail.com or tom@modelrailradio.com. I spend, I create YouTube videos. I create a bunch of tutorials when folks get in contact about the specific interests and problems that they're having with podcasting. I feel very strongly that, I should provide help, basically, to people that want to learn how to do this thing. But there's a, equally large community of people willing to give assistance. The technology associated with podcasting, I'll talk about this in a slide or two's time. But what you need to record a podcast, you need a computer. I think there are some tools now which are trying to move to mobile devices and tablets for doing the podcast recording and editing. I still feel you need a computer. You need some audio recording software, which is usually I use Skype. I have a product called Call Recorder. I know that there are, products that are built into some of the audio, propagation software. So, you need something to record the audio. You then need something to edit the audio. I use a program called Audacity, which is very easy to use. I've recorded a few YouTube videos about how I use Audacity. I use a text editor to create the RSS feeds, which are basically just the show notes plus audio links in a relatively specific format. And ideally, you need a microphone and some headphones just to record a podcast. I don't think the technology about podcasting is really a limiting thing. And I found historically, people were always, oh, what are you using? How are you doing this thing? I know I have a number of friends that have got into podcasts that have amazing audio setups and mixing desks and this kind of stuff. I mean, no one would say the model railroading hobby is about getting the rails to line up. And I think the same is true with podcasting. Like, the technology is a small part of the actual thing. It's more about creating a community. I mean, I think podcasting is fundamentally about creating a community around a set of ideas that you want to put out in the podcast. And I think if you focus on that aspect of it, technology, obviously you've got to get it working, whatever, but not obsess so much about technology. I think more about the community. So when you think about creating a community, in particular in the model railroading hobby, what are the important parts of creating a community? I mean, this is a relatively abstract thing, but I wanted to talk a little bit about that. The thing about model railroading that strikes me more than anything is it's incredibly diverse. There are people from every walk of life, every possible, political, religious, every view seems to be represented in model railroading. And it's a hobby which is international and, spread out all over the globe. And I think one of the things that interested me when I started Model Rail Radio was the notion that you have existing people in the hobby. You pick up Model Railroader magazine, you've got Tony Costa, you've got all these people who are people in the hobby. But actually, the strength of model railroading is that there are, hundreds of thousands of people the globe over that are doing this thing. And what interested me was kind of gathering the lone wolves, like getting, folks that hadn't necessarily, were amazing modelers, amazing model railroaders, had explored, things in operations, layout design, a wide variety of things, but they just weren't collected together. And I think what I found fascinating early on, which has come through the entire recording of Model Rail Radio, was how the different areas of the hobby all respect the other areas. There are very few conflicts where, certain areas in the hobby will not talk to other areas in the hobby. And I think it's one of the beautiful things in model railroading that there's so many diverse interests here and the people who are interested in one area are also kind of interested in the other area as well. So you've got this diversity in these shared interests. So when you think about creating a podcast, ultimately this talk is getting you, the listener, audience participant, to actually think about creating a podcast. You've got to think about what are the qualities of the community that you want. I mean, you might have an existing club, for example. You might have a club of, where someone's really good at various, artistic things. Someone's good at the electrical, so-and-so's, brilliant with regards to track playing. You've got all these people that have their various areas of interest. But what comes through podcasts specifically is a passion. So you've got to think of the audience and you've got to think of this passion that you're introducing the audience to. And if you're doing a community-based podcast, you want to think about which guests you'd have on, right? If you're interested in certain areas, you've got an existing set of, potential guests that already exist with podcasts. But, think about what the qualities of the community you want, who represents that in terms of guests, and maybe even consider a monologue. I mean, I think there are elements in this hobby. I speak to a number of people on Model Rail Radio where I could just listen to them as a monologue. And I think there's so much knowledge in this. And in creating a podcast, particularly a monologue podcast, you've got to think very critically about what you're going to talk about. So I think you could find, even in a monologue, a wide variety of really interesting things in the hobby. Another thing that I think you certainly see on YouTube to a lesser extent in the podcast, which I find fascinating, I mean, particularly on YouTube, is this notion of providing a step-by-step introduction of building a layout. This is something that is relatively, I think, in the broader community, poorly understood. I've certainly found through recording podcasts that a percentage of my listeners haven't even put track down, like commercial track, bought commercial track, put it down. You know, it's interesting that the whole nature of building a layout, and in part, the magazines, you know, have some mysticism elements in it as well. But I think there are a wide variety of possible topics in a podcast, and certainly a step-by-step introduction to building a layout. I mean, I'd love to see, you know, the likes of Clark Kooning do a layout from the ground up. I think he's gotten that feedback from a number of people. Fascinating possibility. Another thing that I would really like to see is the NMRA regionals creating their own podcasts. And I think there are a sufficient number of characters in the various NMRA regional divisions that I think you could create a series of really fascinating podcasts. I know Geordie did some stuff with regards to the UK, but I think really the NMRA as an organization just within the regions could create really interesting regional podcasts and create best practices and standards through that. Another important point, which you've got to think about when you create a podcast, is you're also creating a community of listeners. So you've got to think, if you're going to be creating this group of listeners, what qualities do you want in the listeners and the participants? And this, I think, is really interesting. It's very rarely talked about with regards to creating podcasts, but it's the one thing that I return to is that I've probably created maybe 10 to a dozen podcasts in the past, 12 odd years. And, now 14 years. And within that, the format of the podcast has created the listenership and community around that as well. So when you create a podcast, one of the things I like to ask people is, what features do you want in the community? Now, sometimes this isn't something that's explicit. Sometimes you just discover this thing. And it's interesting thinking about a podcast like building a layout, right? You've got givens, druthers, and things you can, really do without, like things you want to exclude fundamentally when you create these things. So another thing to think about when creating a podcast is the notion of the role that social media now plays. And certainly early on with Model Rail Radio, I embraced Facebook pretty heavily, and it was very useful for growing an active community. Now, I don't have any meaningful surveying with regards to Model Rail Radio, but I get a sense increasingly that fewer and fewer people, listeners and participants, are on Facebook actively. But certainly, Lionel with A Modelist Life has been able to create a very passionate Facebook community roughly a decade after what I did with Model Rail Radio. There's some discussion associated with forums, whether you should create forums with your podcast. Certainly, the late Ryan Anderson did early on with the Model Railcast show. I don't know. I mean, it's not something that I would be interested in maintaining, but there are a lot of folk that are actively participating in forums. And, Twitter and now Instagram, and there are a wide variety of social media components that can be useful in building a community of people who may not have heard of podcasting, right? There's a group still that haven't actually heard that this thing is out there with regards to, audio and video availability. And I think a social media presence will get a certain number of folk anyway to your podcast. But you need to think about that, I think, very strongly associated with how you'd start out. And I think it would be certainly relatively difficult to start a podcast out now without a Facebook group or some means like that. Twitter, Instagram, these kind of things. I know, Tom Gazier and folks like that are very heavy advocates for Twitter usage. But really, it's just something to consider when you create a podcast. So this is a somewhat political topic. I'm not sure where I am for time. Okay, just half an hour. This is a somewhat political topic. I have chosen very directly not to make any money through Model Rail Radio. But a number of folk have created, Patreons or sponsorship or, put ads in. I know Scotty Mason had some thing with that. I'm not sure. I don't think Mike Rose has continued with that. But there's this notion sometimes that your hobby should also make money for you. And I think I certainly not gone into that, although certainly in the past few years, I've started using Patreon more frequently. They did have problems early on with regards to, various security things, which they've resolved. And now, certainly when I find, a variety of creators online, I will support them through Patreon as well. So it's not something where I'm against Patreon necessarily. I just, I can just get some water. I have found historically that I don't want to be charging people money. I think any basic auditing of my life would indicate that I've been incredibly lucky professionally. And it would just seem artificial, basically, to try to offer this thing for money. So probably within the first 4 months of starting Model Rail Radio, I was contacted by Audible about putting Audible ads in. And you'll see Audible ads pretty ad nauseum throughout a variety of different free or near free media. And it just didn't seem to be an adequate use of my time. The nature of finding a book every month, talking about the book in some way, and just creating a link to Audible kind of took away from my time associated with creating the maximum benefit for the listeners and improving the discussion. And I think certainly as I started out, as I started out this thing, I realized that the model railroading hobby, so much of it was around monetization anyway. And I really felt very strongly that this was a hobby where every time people saw an interaction with the hobby, it was associated with some degree of monetization. Someone was trying to make money in every interaction. And I thought it just didn't sit well with me, basically. Excuse me. The true commodity with podcasting is time. And while I've been recording the monthly shows for Model Rail Radio, I've had less free time through COVID than I've had historically. So to say that, podcasting is all amazing or beneficial, really the cost is in time. And for me, it is typically for every hour of audio I put out, I put about 2 hours editing in. I've tried to reduce that down. I've gotten it down to about an hour and a half, but it is a very real thing that the time that you put into it is a real commodity. And when I put time in, and I put videos online to show this as well, so I can provide YouTube links for folks that are interested. But I spend a lot of time improving the quality of the audio. And I do this primarily when I used to do Bio Live. I used to have a number of participants where English wasn't their first language. And I felt really strongly that if they had various, speech tics or what have you that just came through, and look, plenty of English as first language folk have speech tics as well, that I wanted to put out the best audio possible for these people. I felt it was really important that if people spending their time listening to the audio that I was putting out needed to have been of reasonable quality, which means, and I have videos online that show this even to this day, I put a lot of time into editing the audio to make sure that it comes out as crisply and as cleanly as possible. And this is something that I really feel very passionately about. If someone is taking their time to participate in Model Rail Radio, it's important for me to make sure that their best possible audio is put out. And if I don't do that, it means that, well, firstly, there's a fear of coming on a podcast anyway. I mean, my view is they're just talking to me initially. Audio's cleaned up. There will be half a dozen other listeners on the call, maybe more. But, I don't want people to be afraid to participate in Model Rail Radio. What I want is actually, and I've got a lot of feedback to this case, is when people listen back to their audio, they're like, wow, I sound amazing. I sound really good, and they call in again. It creates a positive feedback loop if you can edit the audio in such a way that the people feel good about the audio that's coming out. And to this end, I listen to my own work with a critical ear. You have to be incredibly critical and listen back and think, I really shouldn't do that this way. If you listen to the old audio in Model Rail Radio, there are certain things that I just let slip. I'm not like that anymore. I will occasionally let certain things slip if it's towards the end of a long set of edits where I've cleaned up the audio dramatically, and then it can kind of feel a bit more kind of natural, I guess. But folks saying continuously, lip smacking, these kind of sounds, lots of white space where people are thinking, because I mean, honestly, you ask questions, it takes time for people to respond with answers. They've got to think about the answers. And the folks who, you've had Seth Gardner on, Seth Gardner, in terms of active participants in Model Rail Radio, has an amazing, the depth of thought that you get with every question is considered and answered with a depth of thought there. And I've always found it fascinating that certain participants, Terry Terrence is another favorite of mine. Terry's just a pleasure to listen to. Like, when I think about solo podcast recording, I think the likes of Terry Terrence, if Terry Terrence did a solo podcast about any topic you just, I would enjoy listening to that. So I think certainly with certain participants, less audio editing is necessary. With other participants, a lot of audio editing is necessary. That's fine too, because ultimately what you're doing is you're creating, like I say, a community of respect where anyone can call in and participate, and they can feel a lot better about, what they're doing in the space. And I think that's really important to me. So although it takes time, although, I might joke about it periodically, the time put into audio editing, I think, is time well spent. And ultimately, it makes me feel very positive about the catalog, that all these prior shows, I put in quite a bit of time, and in almost all cases, the best possible audio comes out. So I gave a talk, was it 7 years ago? Probably was about 7 years ago, maybe 8 years ago. I went to an NMRA local here in San Francisco Bay Area. Charlie Getz was still president. And I delivered a talk very similar to this one. But I thought actually it was quite a bit different. But there were a few slides that I wanted to bring forward just to give you some indication of how things have changed. So the first slide I showed, which I'll talk about in a little bit, but I just want to put up there. People are always excited about numbers. Like, how many listeners do you have? What does podcasting mean? And this is what Model Rail Radio, and as it was happening to me early on in real time, it was just like my mind was blown. Like, I had done a small podcast with not very many participants and not really a lot of internal buzz, within the community. But then I started recording Model Rail Radio, and really the sheer volume of listeners to this thing caught me completely and utterly by surprise. So here are some numbers associated with the first, 4 odd years of Model Rail Radio. And to be on that curve initially, I remember when I literally just put it out and we had 4,000 listeners just like that. And just up and up and up. And the whole thing was straight. I talked to the NMRA board probably 2010 and just said, I don't see any ceiling to this thing as it is currently. And I think, the NMRA board was then was missing a beat by not doing podcasts, because you just reached so many people almost immediately. So anyway, wisdom is a wonderful thing. The problem with these numbers is they're all wrong. Like, no matter how you track listeners, the numbers are wrong. So the numbers that I was using were based on unique IP addresses, which literally means a computer at a specific time says that it's on the network with this address. Now, a mobile device, for example, sorry, I should look in the camera when I say that. A mobile device, for example, has 3 to 5 IP addresses in a general listen, which means all those numbers are off by at least 5 times, probably 3 to 5 times. And the whole thing, Libsyn as a company that I'm not in any way affiliated with, has invested a lot of time and a lot of money trying to get these numbers right. I still think they missed the mark. I read constantly, papers of people that say, now we've got the perfect number to catalog. Look, here's where, for me, it's an amazing thing. I can go anywhere in the world, literally anywhere in the world, and I will find listeners. And this is just an amazing thing to me. It is unfathomable that I can put a pin in the globe and I will have half a dozen listeners around. 2010, I was in Adelaide in South Australia. Only 2010 in the... was it 2010, 2011? I don't know. Anyway, I was in Adelaide, South Australia. And listener and frequent participant, Jim Gifford, who has traveled the world meeting listeners, but back then he hadn't, threw a barbecue for me. His immediate train group turned up, and a fellow I went to high school with. Now, I went to high school 2 days drive, about 2 hours flight from where Jim Gifford lives. His train club's, one of his train club members was the father of my friend's wife. He turned up at the barbecue. We had a listener from Hong Kong and his wife turn up at the barbecue in Adelaide in South Australia. This thing is unbelievable. You put your ideas out there. I was going to talk about Hunter Hewson. Hunter Hewson put together a blog about a very small branch line in just south of Niagara Falls. And he had the blog online, and it was associated specifically with a paper plant. Okay, put this blog online. He got a fellow who had worked at the paper plant to contact him through just having the blog online. He wasn't even a model railroader. He just, through Google searching, got in contact with Hunter Hewson. This thing about when you put anything out, you will get way back more than you could ever possibly imagine is even more striking with podcasts. And I've had, dinner in people's kitchens where they've been listeners for long periods of time, and we haven't missed a beat. We're like old friends. This thing is really amazing, associated with getting people involved, creating a really strong positive spirit, and getting these kind of things to happen. So irrespective of what numbers you track or whatever, really podcasting is about friendships and creating a community. So back to the old slides. This is what I used back in the day. It's almost identical now. I use a slightly newer MacBook Pro. I still use Audacity. Levelator, unfortunately, has gone by the wayside. I have to have an old computer that I run Levelator on. Skype is free. Call Recorder, I pay for periodically. The headphones, I'm paying a little bit more for headphones now. I still use my iPhone for roving audio. You can use, any kind of mobile device for that. So very similar to where it was 7 odd years ago. Microphones. So I'm currently recording on a no-name microphone, or maybe the M Audio, which has fixed that bug associated with Skype. The last microphone there. I went through a period of time, maybe 4 years ago, where I just wanted to get a better mic. I've been using Snowball mics for a number of years. The quality went downhill in Snowball relatively rapidly, and I couldn't use them anymore. So I've got a couple of old Snowball mics. I might have given them away, maybe. Blue Yeti came out with a mic. The contact that the mic plugged into created noise. I've used Rode microphones that didn't work properly with Skype. The Shure microphones were staticky and flat. These are expensive microphones. These are $300-$400 microphones. So my advice really is not to spend a lot of money on microphones. I've experimented. It was the wrong move. So the M Audio one that I'm using currently, they were able to fix the situation with Skype. Apparently it was more associated with the USB software. Anyway, so yeah, but my view is the first mistake you can make in podcasting is spend a lot of money early on microphones, because you will not get benefit back. I love wire. Wire for me in everything, including the internet connection. But I'm old school with that. People now, everything's wireless, microphones, headphones, what have you. I'm still fixated by a wire link to some box somewhere. I've always found the quality to be just that little bit much better. If you deal with situations where there's all kinds of buzz, audio goes backwards and forwards, it goes out of order. I've seen every possible permutation over wireless microphones, headphones, internet connections. I just keep everything wired. It makes my life so much easier, particularly with audio editing. So returning to you, the viewer of this particular talk, if you are going to create a podcast, what are you going to create a podcast about? My view is that if you record about your passion, it's easier. What I did with Model Rail Radio was not my passion primarily. I was interested in, the notion of train shows and train clubs and train people as a thing, but it wasn't my primary passion. I think as I talked about historically, working on the simulation stuff first was very useful for me to get into the thing. For you, find something that you're passionate about, because it'll be easier to record about. Do you want assistance? I'm more than happy to provide assistance. I think there's an ever-growing number of us that are picking up bits and pieces associated with this thing. We all have very similar to model railroading scenery techniques. We all have different views. We all have different ways of doing it. There are tens, if not hundreds of thousands of different ways to record a podcast, and every possible permutation exists out there. So I think assistance is not necessarily about saying, this is the one way you have to do it. It's about saying, this is how I do it. Please follow on if you're interested. Now, interestingly enough, I gave Lionel Strang a lot of assistance. He does a bunch of things completely differently to me. And I think Tim Harrison as well. Tim Harrison actually more, mainly through perhaps persistence, but he's more moved towards some of my certainly givens within podcasting. But yeah, the main thing is just record some audio or some video. Doesn't have to be audio, could be video, and give it a go. Just put it out there, get a sense of what you're doing, get a sense of basically what the space is, and give it a go. Because ultimately, I think once you get stuff out there, you're going to be in a better position. I mean, I waited too long. I should have put stuff out earlier. And I think just try it as a format. See what you find. I think perfectly, I have gone for time. So I'm going to say thank you very much for listening to me. I hope my audio video presentation has been useful. And I'm ready to take any questions.
There are quite a few.
Very good. Let me unshare for a start so I can appear in my full.
So the first one was, you mentioned a professor or the professor in the beginning. You mind telling us who that was?
Oh, Dr. Reg Mills and Dr. Lawrence Wolfe were the two professors that I worked with in Australia at the Research School of Physical Sciences and Engineering. I don't know if Professor Wolfe is still alive. I wouldn't think Professor Mills would be still alive. Okay. Their area was thermal physics, basically. So creating environmentally friendly thermal cells.
So do you listen to any model railroad podcast yourself?
Yes, I do. I don't have as much time as I once did to listen to them. I listen to Lionel's show periodically. I always try to give Tim Harrison's show a listen. I listen to Mike Rowe's show periodically. I used to be an obsessive listener with all model railroading podcasts. Unfortunately, I just don't have the time now. So Lionel's, I'll listen to people I know. I occasionally listen to one of his open-ended shows. I find it fascinating. I mean, Lionel has completely created his own format with this thing. So I continue to listen to him. Similarly, Mike Rowe is not historically a podcaster. He has his son working with him. And Tim Harrison, I've got a lot of time for his stuff. So no, I listen to podcasts, yes.
So do you have time for modeling itself?
I'm not a model railroader. So my interests are not, I mean, I have some overlapping interests, but of the modeling interests that interest me, it's primarily associated with historical modeling and war games. And in that, I have a shake in my hand. I can paint, I can dry brush, I can do these kind of things. But my hobby interests through that are finding, interesting painters that have done work and getting little commissions from them.
Okay. The next few questions are all about podcasting themselves, like they should. How often do you think people should, or what's the frequency of the episodes that people should put out?
So for Model Rail Radio, because of the length of the format, I originally did kind of 2 weeks to 3 weeks because they were just really long shows and it took me a long amount of time to actually edit through them. I'm now doing weekly based on COVID, but also I can't put them out weekly. So your time is going to define the frequency, both probably of the recording and when you put them out. The worst case scenario is what I have with Model Rail Radio currently, where I have probably 5 weeks of audio that I've got to edit and put out. So you will find some natural frequency. Now, obviously, an audience will be more receptive to the frequency and sheer volume of audio you put out. So when I did Model Rail Radio early on, I was recording 4 or 5 hour long shows, which were just brutal to edit and put out. But the audience loved them. So the feedback I got was amazing. Keep these 5 hour shows going. I was like, okay, brutal. I know Lionel has found his frequency based, again, on his availability to edit and his work commitments. And I think that's really important. You will find your own balance. The more frequent shows, I think weekly initially is probably ideal if you can spare the time, but you've got to get the length of the show right in that. So it's a very interesting mix.
Yeah, the next question was, how long should an episode be to keep the audience engaged?
That varies greatly. It depends on the topic. If you switch up topics, I think you can get longer shows. If you're doing a single show on track planning, it's more difficult. I think if you can divide it up into segments, you could probably produce longer shows.
Mm-hmm. So do you typically only record audio and not video?
Yeah, I have a face for audio podcasting. I typically record audio. So my view is this mug does not necessarily need to translate to anything. I'd much rather put my voice out. And look, audio for me is just a passion. And I know people are passionate about video. And look, more power to them. We need as much content as possible in this hobby. And I know a lot of people are generating it now in video. So more power to them.
So is there a specific workflow that you follow, like doing research, quests?
So when I do model rail radio, I literally just open the lines and see who calls in. It's one of the most chaotic, unpredictable ways to do this thing, and I'm able to do it. Sometimes I find people that come on fascinating. So I do research after the fact oftentimes when people call in with really fascinating, like I'm editing their audio, I'm like, wow, this is interesting. And then when they call back in, I know a bit more about what they've talked about based on that. But in general, I do very minimal research. I'm just interested in creating the best possible recording circumstance for someone. And perhaps sometimes occasionally moving people outside their comfort zones and getting them talking about other areas that they may not like normally talk or think about.
Cool. So you mentioned it takes 2 hours of work to create 1 hour of podcast.
Yeah.
Is that a fair...
Yeah, it varies greatly. With certain participants, it's much shorter. With other participants, it's longer. So really, it's more down to the participant than anything. So
someone who I know does not live in the States is asking if there's any advice for people to get sponsors or sponsored content for their podcast because it's not US based.
My view is that Audible, a wide variety. I mean, I watch a lot of stuff on YouTube that has exactly the same sponsorship arrangements with the US. I think most of these companies now are international and will offer, because they're just trying to get, particularly the online companies, they're just trying to get broad spread. So my view is there shouldn't be any barrier to any of that, although it's not what I do. So yeah.
Sorry, I saw a question somewhere else that's not appropriate.
Very good.
Do you know
share that with me afterwards?
What age?
There was a good question about age ranges.
Yes.
Do you have any notion of the age of people that listen to your podcast?
Or
maybe the age of people that appear?
I certainly do with regards to the age of people that appear. In almost all cases, we have had a couple of callers that have been under the age of 18. They're ones that I'm slightly more careful about, particularly because, parent participation, this kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. But a majority of our participants are 50 or older. A few are in the kind of 40 to 50 range. A smaller number are under 40. But yeah, we do skew more to 50 plus in terms of those that are calling it.
And then the last big question was, what do you know about podcasting today that you didn't know when you started?
That really, you could go anywhere in the world and meet people based on this thing. I think really the size of the audience is far greater than I ever could have assumed. And I think particularly with regards to a topic that is so closely connected with people's, a train under the Christmas tree, right? There's a season that's connected with this hobby. So when people get a device at the end of the year, they think about what they associate the season with. They put model rail rating in, they get model rail radio. The uptick in listeners at the end of the year is amazing. The new listeners that come in through that year in. So you're dealing with, and now in particular with more than a decade worth of audio, they can start at the beginning and work their way through to the catalog. So They come at the end of the recordings, now when I'm recording currently, with more than a decade worth of audio. I mean, sadly, we've had people pass away, but we've had a huge amount of development. Like the movement of people through the show as they've built layouts, as they've moved, as they've changed, as variety of circumstances have changed through their lives. I mean, we've captured a decade worth of life in some cases. I mean, Clark Kooning is a good example of this, and it's kind of captured subtly and obviously connected with model railroading, but it is an amazing thing. The whole thing is just amazing, associated with the community aspect.
Okay, last question. Do you see an end to MRR? We hope not.
So I've said, I already have, believe me, there are a wide variety of ways this thing could end, and it's not going to. If I'm snuffed out, I actually have Mike Slater lined up. I have a variety of folk lined up. So, I mean, the late Ryan Anderson is a good example of this. He died very quickly. No one knew that was going. I mean, he had announced it, and then literally a month later, he was no longer here. So it's important when you create these things to actually think about that. Now, Mike is about my age, so yeah, I mean, something could happen to Mike as well. But I mean, the audio is there, and I don't foresee it. I mean, what's happened through this period, this lockdown period, has just reinforced even more that model rail radio is a community that has a real need to exist, right?
Yes.
So yeah, it's not going anywhere.
Well, Tom, thank you very much.
I had a couple. Hang on, Speed. I had a couple of questions to ask to Tom.
Okay.
That he couldn't get away with from reading the feed. So, one of the questions, you've been around doing podcasts in the hobby for 10 years. You're not a model railroader in terms of you don't really model. This is your aspect of the hobby, and so obviously with NMRAX we have 2 free presenters and 3 people that are very actively involved in this, and Speed, 4 of us who are not in the core demographic that's the NMRA is targeting for recruitment and retention, and the board is not interested in targeting us particularly. But do you feel that the hobby's growing? Do you see younger people coming into this hobby or new people coming into this hobby?
The thing that always captivated me is the way, and the magazines are partially, really the magazines are to blame, the NMRA to a lesser extent. This whole nature of the hobby dying is just not something that I've seen in my lifetime. I mean, in doing this for 10 years, if anything, I've seen an amazing growth in resourcefulness, in creative interest. I don't see this thing as, I mean, the whole narrative associated with the hobby dying is made by people who, really are not surveying the new folk that are coming in. And really, probably, whenever you hear this notion that the hobby's dying, you probably should move away from the views and philosophies of the people making these claims, because it's certainly not something I've seen. In fact, if anything, I find it extraordinary how vibrant and changing this hobby is, and how it's moving into a position which can weather, major manufacturers now going out of business. I think model railroading could survive that, right?
Correct.
Mm-hmm. Correct. So I had one more question, and so we both work in the digital space in our professional lives. In fact, all 3 of us, but particularly me and you work in a digital space, and I'm heavily involved in digital transformation around the world. That is my passion, and so there's been a significant amount of that recently. I've actually written a couple of articles that are going in various regional NMRA magazines about digital transformation in the hobby. So what are your views on digital transformation in the hobby? Obviously accelerated by COVID, but probably seen it getting more speed over the last few years anyway. So what's your views?
I think we need to learn from this experience. I think we need to find best practices. I think we should look outside model railroading as well, because every hobby that I track is having to deal with COVID. Every hobby that I track is having to move from having conferences and conventions physically to virtually. And within this, we're all making best practices through this. But I think we've got to reach outside our hobby, look at the best practices elsewhere, and look, hats off to you. Hats off to all of you. But Gordy in particular, I can't say enough positive stuff about what you've done here. And I think you're certainly moving the discussion forward in the right direction. And anything I can do to help, more power to you. Thank you for having me on today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Tom.
Thank you. So we've just got one last thing to do, which is we're just going to transition over to the wheel of sandpaper. As you are an Australian, you can appreciate how much that is, and how important it is to the world of Australian cricket. And Gordy's going to spin the wheel, and we should see. This is just a bit of lag as we go to Australia. Hopefully, we see the wheel is spinning. Excellent. And the question is, do you prefer to rail fan on a layout, or do you prefer operations? So rail
Ooh.
fanning or operations?
I love operations.
Answers in the chat. Oh, there you go. There's one answer. So answers in the chat, guys. We'll be back here shortly with Paul from New Zealand. So we've gone all the way around the world. Hang in there.